Disclaimer: while this video will be discussing a social media post written by a real Muslim woman, I will avoid as much as possible any identifying details about this person. My intention isn't to demonize or judge her, but to explore her post as an example of Islam's impact on women, for better or worse, and the potential challenges these kinds of cases bring up to ex-Muslims like myself and society as a whole. In that spirit, I want to also request that viewers make no attempt to out this person and to avoid any disparaging insults about her in the comments. My intention with this channel is to do my best to focus my critiques on the ideas and teachings of religion and how they influence believers' thoughts and actions, as opposed to criticizing the believers themselves. Hello, I'm Secular Spirit, and the inspiration for this video is a social media post I recently stumbled upon that, well, it's really got me thinking over the last couple days. The post was written by a Muslim woman living in a Western country who shares her appreciation for the religious accommodations her company made for her. In her post, this person, let's call her Muna, she shares that she believes Islamic teachings that states that Muslim women can't travel more than 80 kilometers without being accompanied by a Mahram. Now, what's a Mahram? Put simply, a Mahram is someone you aren't allowed to marry because they're closely related to you, like your parents, grandparents, siblings, uncles, and aunts. Someone can also become a Mahram through marriage, like your spouse. If you're a Muslim woman, you don't have to cover yourself with a hijab if you're in the company of a Mahram. I should mention at this point that Muna happens to wear a niqab, covering her entire face except her eyes. So, according to the majority of Muslim scholars, in the case of someone like Muna, she should not travel long distances without a male mahram accompanying her as a guardian of sorts. The scholars base this on several hadiths, with some also specifying the travel time which would necessitate a mahram. In one hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet Muhammad explicitly says, "A woman should not travel for more than 3 days except with a mahram." In the case of Muna, she explains in a comment to her post that the scholars she follows calculate that 3 days travel without modern technology equates roughly to 80 kilometers. Now, Muna faced a dilemma when her company announced a work trip that would take her more than 80 kilometers away from her home. She couldn't travel without a mahram, but she didn't want to miss out on the trip. She was also worried what her company would think of her if she divulged all of this information to them. And yet, Muna decided to do just that. She informed her company about her religious beliefs regarding travel, and they told her she was brave for sharing them. They also proceeded to cover all the travel and accommodation expenses of her father so he could accompany her on the work trip. And so this is the story that she shares in her post. In the comments, Muna received a shower of praise from Muslims and non-Muslims alike, who viewed this as a celebration of religious expression and inclusion. So speaking honestly, my initial reaction when I read this post was sadness. I admired her bravery, but I felt sad because from my perspective, it seemed like this woman was imposing what I feel is a needless and oppressive restriction on herself that keeps her dependent on men when she would more than likely be completely safe going on this work trip on her own. To share my own personal experience, although I grew up Muslim in the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim country, my mother didn't follow this Islamic teaching in the instances when she traveled alone. Neither did most of the Muslim women in my family scattered all over the world, as far as I'm aware of anyway. But I was aware that others in the society around me practiced this, that some women never traveled alone. Usually they travel with their husbands or fathers. Speaking on my education on the subject, I learned of a few reasons for why this teaching exists. All of them revolve around the need to protect women. Earlier I mentioned that Muna would be completely safe going on a work trip with colleagues in a Western country. But of course, none of us are ever completely safe, are we? There's all sorts of potential scenarios that I'm sure all of us can imagine. Perhaps you're walking back to your hotel at night and a stranger robs you, or worse. Perhaps you're alone with a work colleague you thought you could trust, and they abuse that trust. Or simpler than that, you end up having an accident and there isn't anyone nearby to help you. In the minds of many Muslims, and non-Muslims too, a lot of these harmful scenarios can be avoided altogether with a companion acting as a guardian. And a male guardian will typically be stronger than the woman and dissuade other men with intentions to do bad things when approaching the Muslim woman. You could also make a good argument that a Muslim woman wearing a niqab in a Western country might be an easy to spot target for harassment and abuse from locals who hate Muslims. There's a lot of valid points here. This Muslim perspective on the necessity of a mahram to escort a traveling woman isn't wholly irrational. I can see where it's coming from. In the world, there are men who mean to harm women. I'm not denying that. And in my own life, there have been times where I've been asked, and I've also offered, to escort women who are walking somewhere at night, for example. However, it's important to note here, especially to anyone watching this video who isn't Muslim, that this notion of protecting women is explained by and linked to ideas about how women are weak, physically and spiritually. Traveling can be tiring. It can lead to difficult and unfamiliar situations. Because women are so weak, the argument goes, they of course need a physically stronger man to look after them, or else they'd be helpless. And of course, if a woman is spiritually weak, she may be tempted to do evil, sinful things of her own volition. As an aside, if a Muslim man is equally spiritually weak and tempted by sin, they're encouraged to travel with the company of fellow Muslims or to go to a local mosque. After doing some research, I found that some Muslims treat this teaching as something that made sound sense during the time of Muhammad in the often dangerous Arabian desert more than 1400 years ago. They even believe this teaching could be a good practice today, depending on where the Muslim woman is traveling, but they don't view it as a necessary thing to follow in the 21st century. Of course, then there are Muslims who follow this teaching to the letter as a requirement from God, much like Munna, who requested that her father accompany her. Now, I want to go back to my feeling of sadness and explore where it comes from. I spent my entire childhood as a practicing Muslim, only to realize as my doubts crept in and as I started the emotional and mental process of leaving Islam and letting go of my belief in God, that all these teachings that I believed were correct and true and for my own good were perhaps the products of flawed human beings with different values from a different era. Today, as an atheist, unless evidence of a divine alternative is provided, all I'm left with is a man-made source for these Islamic teachings. I'm not alone in this. Many ex-Muslim women I've spoken to over the years have shared a similar experience. They believed so wholeheartedly that the limitations imposed on them by Islam and encouraged by their Muslim loved ones were for their own good, and it was something that had to be done because of the nature of the world. They also shared with me how troubling and harmful these teachings were to them and their sense of self-worth and independence. In one instance, I spoke to an ex-Muslim woman who told me that she actually became more religious and more diligent in following conservative Islamic values as a way to get rid of her doubts. She started wearing a hijab and became homophobic. But in the end, the doubts prevailed and she realized all the terrible things she'd done to herself and others. So I can't help but wonder, what if Munna might be someone similar? What if she was taught, or to put it more bluntly, indoctrinated from a young age that a good Muslim woman travels with a mahram, that this is what God, the loving creator of the universe and the one who punishes us in hell if we disobey him, says is best for her? Having had these teachings instilled in her at such a formative age, it would be unsurprising that she would continue believing these teachings as an adult, as was the case with me and so many other ex-Muslims. We didn't really question these things when we were Muslim. Perhaps she hasn't really questioned them either. But now, I can't help but ask, how much of all of this is Munna's reality, and how much of it is it me projecting the negative experiences and understanding of Islam of myself and ex-Muslim women on her? I'm sad for Munna because I feel like I've been in her position in many ways. I feel that ex-Muslim women have been in her position even more so. But is that sadness justified? Does any part of Munna feel like she's missing out, that she's being harmed or harming herself? Now, what Muslims and perhaps others will say is, why do I care? Why am I making a video about this? Why can't I just leave this person alone and focus on my own life? I've been told that by some Muslims about my entire channel's existence, actually. The perspective of many of the people liking Munna's post, even if they disagree with the teaching and wouldn't follow it personally, is that Munna isn't harming anyone. So why can't she celebrate and practice her religion the way she chooses? They'll say that Munna isn't calling for anyone's help and her post doesn't appear to be a distress call. So why am I, a man no less, getting involved with my opinion on something that is none of my business? To clarify here, I believe she should be able to practice her religion how she chooses, as long as she isn't harming anyone, even if I believe she may be harming herself. After all, she is an adult who appears proud of her choice, and she's someone who's publicly celebrating that choice. Some will also say that I'm guilty of imposing my beliefs, which are shaped significantly by the humanist and liberal traditions of the West, on a person who follows different beliefs and a different viewpoint of the world. In essence, we can only view other cultures from our biased cultural lens. It's definitely the case that other cultures view some things I value as harmful. So who's objectively right then, the argument goes? Perhaps respecting other cultures and leaving them be is the way to go. I personally don't think so, but I think that might be a subject that deserves its own video. And then there's a fact that a lot of Muslims believe their teachings are universally right because they come from God himself. But again, perhaps that's a subject for another day. So what to do if you're someone like me, who has lived the Muslim culture as well as the Western one, whose life and perspective is essentially a hybrid of both? I've been on the inside of Islam and I've experienced the harms. With all my experiences and those that other ex-Muslims have shared with me, I worry that Muna is experiencing those harms too. That's why I can't help but want to ask Muna questions, out of a desire to help her see things from my perspective, so she can re-examine hers with this new information and decide for herself then how to proceed. No harm is being done in Muna's case though, some will now repeat. Perhaps no harm to others, but how has this practice affected Muna and women like her? How has it impacted her sexuality, her romantic relationships? What other related and connected beliefs does she have about men, sex, and the world in general that might be more blatantly harmful to her and potentially to others? To understand her perspective and identify how I might be projecting my own biases against Islam on her, I've considered reaching out to Muna as Secular Spirit, and I've even considered potentially inviting her to come on my channel to share her perspective. But I haven't contacted Muna yet because I worry about intruding into her life. But if I did contact her, I'd ask Muna a whole bunch of questions. Why do you follow this Islamic teaching? What do you think might happen if you don't follow it? Are you worried about God's wrath? Are you worried men will harm you? Or is it both? How do you view a society like the Western country you live in, where men and women interact freely? Is that inherently wrong? How do you view any man who isn't a Mahram? Do women always need men like their fathers, brothers, and husbands to protect them? To finish off this video, I want to explain a bit more directly why the story of Muna is sticking with me. Life is inevitably filled with suffering for each and every one of us. Suffering already hits us from so many external sources. And the saddest things to me are the suffering and limitations we impose on ourselves. Not only do I feel sad because Muna is imposing this limitation on herself, I'm also sad because she's actually out there, celebrating this limitation and sharing with thousands of people who concerningly agree with her that it's a good thing, even if some wouldn't impose that limitation on themselves. This self-imposed suffering isn't exclusive to Muslims, of course, but I talk about it because I once imposed a lot of suffering and limitations on myself when I was Muslim, and I've shed these things over the years to become a healthier, happier person. If we all never talk about this reality of suffering, self-imposed or externally imposed, if we never present ideas that run counter to it and challenge it, then it just goes on unchallenged and it goes on celebrated by Muslims and the well-intentioned people who seek to be their allies. In that sense, this isn't just about Muna. This is about her and the millions of Muslim women who are taught that this is the best way to live their lives and the ripple effect it has on the world. For anyone watching, ex-Muslims, Muslims, atheists, and believers of other religions, here are some questions I want to leave you with. Is it offensive to tell someone like Muna that you disagree with this Islamic teaching of hers and that you believe it is harmful to herself and other women? Is there an appropriate public forum to discuss your thoughts about Muna and this Islamic teaching? And should I reach out to Muna? Do I have a legitimate reason to do so, or am I completely wrong and I'm just projecting and I should just leave her alone? Or should I just leave her alone altogether, regardless of whether you agree with me or not? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you found the subject interesting, I'd really appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another video soon.